say many times, I am not a gun collector. Now, this might belie that a little bit, and I'm not a sword collector. I think total of both guns and edged weapons in my collection total over 110, but I'm not a weapons collector. Actually, I'm not. I'm a history collector. And I am interested in the history of the weapons, but also of other artifacts. I have in my collection over a dozen uniform parts. I have a couple of hundred letters written by Civil War soldiers. I have a Civil War hammock used by a Civil War sailor. Those things to me are just as important as the guns and the swords and that sort of thing. The items I have here cover a great area of the Civil War. One thing, though, that I'd like to point out, and some people might object to this, but quite often it's called the war between the states. That would imply that states on both sides were united in their particular efforts. Not true. Certainly in the North, there were people that did not want to go to war against the South. General Sherman was one. Sherman was a Unionist, but did not want to abolish slavery. He would have been happy if after the war it could have gone back the way everything was before. Not very realistic, but that was the deal. Every state in the South, with the exception of South Carolina, had at least one regiment in the Union Army. In my collection, which I didn't bother to bring here, I have a Burnside carbine that was carried by a trooper in the 2nd Texas Cavalry, USA. Texas had 2 regiments in the Union Army. The one thing I'll be pointing out here is I have a pistol that belonged to a man in the
Bob,
first.
if you want to take your mask off,
Fine with
we're
me.
probably fine here. Yeah, we can.
I've already had this stuff, but
That's true.
the see, he interrupted. Now I got to start at the beginning. One of the revolvers that I'll be talking about belonged to a member of the 1st Virginia Light Artillery, USA. Tennessee had over 14 regiments in the Union Army. Virginia had more than that, but of course they were mostly from the area that we now call West Virginia, which at the beginning of the war was still part of Virginia. Mike mentioned about the Battle of Glorietta. We are approaching the, what would it be, 159th anniversary of the Battle of Glorietta, which concerned Texas troops, Confederate obviously, and mostly Colorado, but not exclusively Colorado troops. One of the pivotal points of the Battle of Glorietta was the destruction of the Confederate wagon train at Johnson's Ranch. This sword blade, obviously it's been in a fire, was found at Johnson's Ranch by children playing there in the 1940s. Undoubtedly, what was left of a cache of weapons that was blown up and burned at the wagon train. Now, I should point out, I will leave this display up for a while, so after the talk you're free to come up and look at things. I would ask you not to handle them without permission, because some of the stuff is fairly fragile. These three items were also found on the Glorietta battlefield. Spur, probably, well, I started to say probably Confederate, but that's hard to say. It's non-regulation, so it could have been either side. A bullet from a Sharps carbine, a round ball, 69 caliber, which it's difficult to say whether or not that came from a musket or from a exploding shell, because the exploding shell and the canister of the guns used at Glorietta used 69 caliber ball. So there's a tendency to say, well, they had a lot of smoothbore muskets there. Maybe they did, but the fact that you find them, the round ball, does not necessarily mean that. The large iron ball came from canister, which is literally a shotgun shell fired out of a cannon. Again, I am a collector of history. This pistol is what collectors call a Model 1862 Colt Police. Probably Colt in 61, before the war started, recognized police forces as a market and came up with this gun. When the war started, they very quickly were purchased, not by the government, but by private individuals, mainly officers, since officers had to purchase their own equipment. This one is very interesting to me. I had this for about 30 years before I could figure out who carried it, because it's got three names on it. On the butt, very hard to read, in what I call engraving style number 1, it says John Foote, Captain, 2nd Minnesota. I believe that's right. And then in what I call engraving style number 3, died 1862, Mill Springs campaign. On the back strap, in engraving style number 2, it says S.C. Foote, and then in engraving style number 3, U.S. Volunteer Navy, name of the ships, etc. And then in here says Alfred Foote, and this is all in engraving style number 3. Oh, this also says died 1862. Is Alfred Foote, 14th USA, which means regular army. And it lists the campaigns, including Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, the Petersburg campaign, the Weldon Railroad, which was all part of that. And he was badly wounded at the Weldon Railroad. I could not put them together. John Foote was easy. I went to the Minnesota records and found him. The Navy records are virtually non-existent because they kept records by ship at that time, not as an overall roster of people. So that was almost impossible. Alfred Foote was easy because I went to the 14th Regulars, but he was from Geneva, New York. This guy was obviously from Michigan, and who knew about this guy? Now, to say I'm computer illiterate is an understatement. I can barely turn the damn things on, and only on a good day can I turn one off. I had...
Were they all related?
Wait. I asked several people to research this for me, and they came up with a blank. I also was curious because the last name Foote, although he spelled it, or it's always spelled with an E here, the second admiral of the Union Navy was Andrew Foote, Civil War. But Andrew Foote spelled his name without the E, and they had it backwards, but anyway, one of them spelled it without the E. Well, the one day that everything was working right and I learned how to turn on the computer, just for laughs, I put in John Foote's name. I came up with a hit, said he was in the Minnesota Regiment, and then it says there was a memorial written by his father whose name was Samuel Alfred Foote. Oh my gosh, there's the names. So I got the book, it's a reprint, but I got the book. And in the book, the father gives a memorial to John Foote, who died probably of tuberculosis. John Foote was from New York, it turns out, but had developed a very bad cough early in life, moved out west to try and cure the cough, settled in Red Wing, Minnesota, where it turns out another Foote relative, a guy named Benjamin Foote, lived. And incidentally, Benjamin Foote ran the tannery for what later became Red Wing Boots. But anyway, he stayed there. When the war started, he joined Michigan Regiment, fought in the south at Mill Springs, Kentucky, and of course his cough came back very bad. And according to the memorial, he resigned his commission and came home to Geneva, New York to die. And died in the arms of his brother, Alfred Foote. Holy cow, there's two of them. And then it says that the author had 3 sons in the service, including one in the Navy. And I thought, it's got to be Samuel. Then, because I was on a roll, and I hadn't turned the computer off yet, I put in the father's name. And it turned out the father, who was a judge in Geneva, New York, had written a biography, autobiography. And in it, he mentions John, he mentions Alfred, and he mentions Samuel, who he says got a commission in the volunteer Navy with the help of cousin Admiral Andrew Foote. They were all related. And in it were the pictures of all 3 Foote brothers. John, Samuel, Alfred. Alfred survived the war, was badly wounded at Weldon Railroad, only to die in, I believe it was 1867. He stayed in the Army. When I've given this talk before about the Foote brothers, and pardon me for this, I call it a footnote of history. This rather ugly pistol, and I've been accused of having an ugly pistol collection. This is a Savage revolver, 36 caliber, Union-made gun. It's a lever action revolver. Bang. Now, obviously it was not very well balanced. It had a very complicated mechanism. Quite a few were purchased by the Army, I think around 20,000. This particular one has initials carved in the grips, and it's JFMCA, which we have figured out stands for, I think it was James I'm sorry, it's PFMCA. Peter F. McAuley, Private, 11th Texas Infantry, CSA. And to substantiate that, and I have never seen a holster for a Savage revolver before. This is obviously a put-together holster made to accept the Savage. So it is, I've never found the exact reference, but I'm told there's a reference that says that a Union supply ship was captured at Galveston, Texas in 1862, and that it had, among other things, Savage revolvers on there. So that's very likely where McNally got his pistol. I mentioned how West Virginia had a bunch of Union regiments, and this is the pistol that was carried by Joseph, I think his first name was Joseph Bockley, from Switzerland, as a matter of fact, in the 1st West Virginia Light Artillery, USA. This is what's called a Colt Pocket, model 1849, 31 caliber. I also have Bockley's spurs, his belt, buckle, and holster, which I didn't bring, and a powder flask. And Mr. Bockley served with the 1st West Virginia Light Artillery, I think 3 years, I'm not positive on that. And then later on rejoined the Union Army in something called the Veterans Reserve Corps. And I have his enlistment papers for that. Another Colt Police. This one is engraved on the back. Captain, so I'm not having a pen left. Douglas, I think it is, Chase. Company, I think it's B, because I don't quite remember. I have bad eyes, so I can't read this, but 2nd Battalion, 17th U.S. Infantry, again, a regular unit. The 17th U.S., among other places, was at Gettysburg, within about 500 yards of the 14th U.S. Captain Chase has an interesting history. This is Captain Chase. We think about the Civil War started in April 1861. Everybody knows that. Actually, it probably started in 1854 with the Kansas Nebraska Act, which declared that the territories could decide to go slave or free by popular sovereignty. Nebraska, of course, would have gone north. Kansas was up for grabs. And when they had the vote, a whole bunch of people from Missouri crossed the river and voted to make Kansas a slave state. The residents of Kansas, most of them abolitionists, voted for a free state. There were actually two capitals in Kansas for a while, and they didn't get along real well. There were basically Missourians that had voted for slavery, and basically Kansans that had voted for the free state. There was several, maybe many instances of people going back and forth and having minor wars among themselves. Anybody seen the movie Outlaw Josie Wales? Well, I don't recommend it, but I mean, it's a neat entertainment. But it shows what they're calling redlegs, which are a northern cavalry unit. They're somewhat modeled after the Jayhawkers, which was a Kansas Free State unit that preyed on the Confederates that moved into Kansas. And the Confederates had their own, or the Southerners had their own similar unit called the Border Ruffians. You know, the person we hear most about involved in that was a guy named John Brown, who, although he wasn't actually a Jayhawker, he was certainly of that ilk. Well, this man, Captain Chase, in 1856, went to Kansas, joined a Jayhawker unit commanded by a man named Jim Lane, who became notorious. He was sort of the Union version of Quantrill or some of the other partisans on the other side. And he rode with Lane for about a year. Lane later became a senator from Kansas. And after his sojourn in Kansas, Missouri, he then, when the war broke out, joined the 17th U.S. Regulars. And there the story gets sort of interesting. At the Battle of Gettysburg, he was wounded, reportedly by a piece of shrapnel that hit him right in the back on his pistol belt, severely bruising him. And in his report, he says, I was not able to excavate for 10 days, meaning he could not have a bowel movement. So I suspect that changed him from a regular to an irregular. Anyway, there is a I don't find any record that he bothered with a pass or anything. No, he may have, but anyway, he eventually goes back to the regiment, and apparently is not well received by the colonel and or the regimental surgeon, because he writes a letter to his senator, a guy named Shivers Colfax. And in the letter he says, I am fit only for light duty, but the regimental surgeon and the colonel are my sworn enemies and will not allow me to be on light duty. But I would like to get transferred to become the colonel of the black regiment. Well, if you're on light duty, how would you become the colonel of the regiment? Anyway, Schuyler Colfax gets the letter and passes the letter on to the Secretary of War. Secretary of War passes it on to General Meade, the commander of the Army of the Potomac at that time. General Meade passes the letter on to the colonel. Things did not go well after that. Chief was tried by a court-martial, found guilty for conduct unbecoming to an officer, and basically cashiered. However, through political influence from Colfax and others, the verdict was overturned, but then he resigned and spent the rest of his life as a lawyer and a judge. Seemed to me like he was practicing during the war, but stay with the gun for a moment. Back to Glorietta. This revolver, which is not a Colt, made by a company named Metropolitan in New York. When the Colt factory burned in 1864, this company and others jumped in and came out with Colt copies. It's almost impossible to tell this one from a Colt unless you look really close. All of Colt's patents had expired except the one that called for safety pins on the back of the cylinder so you could put the hammer on the pins. So instead of pins, they put notches in the back of the cylinder. Anyway, this one, with a holster, which I believe is a military holster that has been revised to basically a Western holster, Slim Jim holster, using old leather because you can see the remains of stitching on it. Belonged to a man named Spruce McCoy Baird. Spruce McCoy Baird, and here's a little picture of him, had a interesting career. He was born in Kentucky, probably on what we would consider the wrong side of the tracks. There probably weren't any tracks at that time, but down the hill. And he got enamored with a young lady who lived up the hill. His attentions to the young lady were frowned on by the lady's parents. Then the war with Mexico came up. He left Kentucky, joined a Texas regiment in the war with Mexico. After the war, the colonel of that regiment was a man named Wood, who became the second governor of Texas. After the war, Spruce McCoy Baird was appointed judge of Santa Fe County, Texas. You know where Santa Fe County, Texas was? You're sitting in it. Texas made a land grab, if you will, that went all the way up the east side of the Rockies, basically the Front Range, into southern Wyoming. When, after the war with Mexico, the U.S. government settled with Texas and bought all the land for $100,000 from Texas. So when McCoy Baird shows up in Santa Fe and says, I am the judge, they said, like hell you are. But anyway, he stayed in Santa Fe, eventually became the Attorney General of New Mexico in 1860. And then when the Confederates, Texans, came up, what eventually ended up at the Battle of Glorietta, they camped, one of the columns camped on his ranch. And there's a drawing of his ranch made by John's ancestor, Alfred Petticolas, and he mentions having camped on Judge Baird's ranch. After the defeat at Glorietta, or retreat from Glorietta, and then the Confederate Army ended up around Albuquerque and fought a skirmish basically with the Union at a place named Peralta right outside of Albuquerque, in which what was left of the Confederate wagon train was destroyed along with Baird's all personal belongings, because he saw handwriting on the wall, and when he saw the Confederates were going back to Texas, he figured he had to too. So he loaded up his family and all their belongings, but unfortunately the wagon was caught in the Union advance. His family participated in a long, horrendous march down the west side of the Rio Grande through the mountains to El Paso, where he became a colonel of the 4th Arizona Cavalry, CSA. He basically, the 4th Arizona didn't do much except chase Indians because they never got the full strength. After the war, he became a circuit riding judge with offices in Trinidad and Golden, Colorado. He died in courthouse in Cimarron, New Mexico, to get the date, but it was sometime after the war. Anybody see the movie Glory?
Yeah.
You know, it was all about the 54th Massachusetts, and it culminated in the Battle of Battery Wagner, or Fort Wagner. This gun was there, not at the movie, the first time around. Engraved on the buttstock is Lieutenant James A. Barrett, Company H, 48th NYSV, New York State Volunteers. It's been damaged. The loading lever has been repaired. There is a bruise on the frame here where something is hidden. When I spotted this at the Colorado Gun Collectors show many years ago, it also had a sword with it, which I have, but I didn't bother to bring. The sword is without a scabbard. Well, a dealer had this, and another dealer was trying to get it. And as they quite often do, they pointed out everything that was wrong with the gun. Well, the frame is bruised. Well, the loading lever has been replaced. Sword doesn't have a scabbard. Well, I didn't care about all of that stuff. Anyway, I ended up getting it. The next business day, I hot-footed it down to the Denver Public Library, and first I looked up the Adjutant General report for the state of New York, and indeed, Barrett was a real guy. And then I thought I'd try my luck. It wasn't a computer, luckily, this is before a computer. I would try my luck, and I would look for a regimental history. Well, the Denver Public Library had 30 New York regimental histories, but there were over 300 New York regiments, so the odds weren't real great. But they did have the regimental history for the 48th New York, and went through it, found the report on the battle at Battery Fort Wagner or Battery Wagner. And the author says, I was on detached duty. The following is a report written by Lieutenant James A. Barrett, Company H. That might have been when the librarian asked me to put dancing on the table. And in part, he mentions how they advanced on the fort, how it was dark, how the regiment on their left was the 54th Massachusetts, with Colonel Shaw in the 54th Massachusetts. And he mentions how they assaulted the fort, they got into one bastion with 2 guns, were unable to turn them to any use. They suffered mightily, not only from the Confederate, but from supporting columns coming up in their rear, who mistook them for the rebels. That a retreat was ordered, but not altogether understood, so he, Barrett, stayed and ordered all who could to keep firing and got ammunition for them from the cartridge boxes of the dead and wounded. When that ran out, he ordered all who could to retreat. He did, and he mentions crossing the moat, which was full of their dead and wounded. And then he says, my sword scabbard was shot away, and my pistol bent and useless. So I didn't really care about the repairs on the pistol or the lack of the scabbard on the sword anymore, since it happened at Battery Wagner. This pistol is a Colt, but was carried by a man named Cornelius Barnhart, who was in the first, he enlisted in the 1st South Carolina Regular Infantry, and there's his enlistment papers. Well, it turns out there are 3 1st South Carolinas, and that got a little confusing, especially when you're trying to research it. And the 1st South Carolina later became the 3rd South Carolina Heavy Artillery. But once you're the 1st of something, you never want to be the 3rd. So in a lot of the official correspondence, they still referred to themselves as the 1st. Anyway, the 1st South Carolina, or 3rd South Carolina Heavy Artillery, manned the guns at Fort Moultrie and also Battery Wagner. And I don't think he was at Battery Wagner, but certainly the guns of his regiment were firing at this unit as they attacked. With it, I have a original Confederate belt buckle and belt, a Confederate cap box, an English-made powder flask for that type of pistol, and a $10 bill, Confederate $10 bill. That was in the pocket of Sergeant Cook when he surrendered what was left of his regiment at Appomattox Courthouse. He was a great-grandfather of a very, very good friend of mine, Richard Capps, who was a World War II veteran. With it, I have a facsimile of the parole that Sergeant Cook $10 bill was at Appomattox. Also, there was, and I have a copy of this too, the morning report written by the ranking officer of the Georgia unit, 21st, I think, at the time of Appomattox. But the ranking officer was Sergeant Cook. There were just 16 people left in his command at the time. I'm sure there were a lot of desertions at that point, and he notes on April the 9th, just one sentence, General Lee surrendered today. Some swords. I like shiny swords. Foot officer sword, very good condition, nice engraving, good scabbard. Don't know anything about it other than it came with a picture of a Union officer holding that sword. Don't know anything about him other than on this hat is the hunting horn insignia for infantry at the time. The cross rifles that we know of now for infantry did not come in until the 70s. There's a hunting horn with a 7 in it. So he was in the 7th something. The sword was made by a maker in Newark, New Jersey. This rather handsome sword. Wonderful engraving. Silver-plated grip. That was actually my first shiny sword. On the scabbard is a silver plaque that reads, presented by the loyal citizens of Bethlehem to Captain William H. Stolzenbach, Company C, 46th Regiment, PVB, which stands for Pennsylvania Veteran Volunteers, Honor of the Brave, Atlanta, 1864. This is a picture of Company C of the 46th Pennsylvania, and that is Stolzenbach right there. The irony is that when he was presented the sword, he no longer had a right hand to carry the sword. He had lost the right hand except for the thumb at the Battle of Atlanta. But I have a newspaper article telling about the presentation of the sword after, of course, he had been wounded. He later died, I believe in 67, but I'm not going to quite remember, while swimming in the Atlantic Ocean near Atlantic City. And one has to wonder if this wasn't post-traumatic stress syndrome, that he decided to go swimming in the ocean with only one hand. And that was a way of ending it. Who knows, but that's a possibility. This sword was carried by George Gregory Stambro, the 116th New York. George Gregory Stambro had been studying to become a doctor. When the war broke out, his doctor he was studying under raised a regiment, or a company. And it quite often happened, a prominent person in the community raises a company, he becomes the captain. and he named George as the lieutenant. Well, apparently the captain realized after a while you could get hurt doing this kind of stuff. So he resigned. George became the captain. On May the 27th, 1863, he was leading a charge of this company at Fort Hudson, Louisiana, when he got a little close to a bullet. Been repaired, went through the scabbard. He was waving the sword at the time, apparently, so the sword's fine. Shortly thereafter, he resigned his commission. Now, I've read several resignations. A lot of them are just baloney. I had a pistol once that the owner wrote a lengthy resignation letter. And the colonel endorsed it with one word: incompetent. George, I think, was very honest. He said, "I'd like to resign my commission in the infantry to make room for someone more qualified than I, but I will transfer to the medical department for which I have been trained." And indeed he did. He became assistant surgeon at the Army Hospital in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and there met his future wife. Now you gotta blame, this is going too long, you gotta blame John Petticoat for this, because the last time I gave a talk, he said, "Where are the long arms?" Well, I don't bring them because they're too damn heavy, but anyway. If you come back next week when the reenactors are here, you'll see most of them will have a representation of this. This is model 1855 U.S. rifle musket, 58 caliber. Fired what is called a mini ball, which is not, first of all, it's not mini, and secondly, it's not a ball, it's a projectile. But it had the Maynard priming system, but basically a roll of caps, like in your cap gun. The idea was, pull a hammer back, it advances the cap, you pull the trigger, you don't have to put a percussion cap on. The problem with it was one, there was no way of knowing when you were on your last cap, unless you were counting up to 25, and I suspect in the heat of battle that was rather difficult to do. Also, there was enough blowback from the black powder in there that it weakened the springs and broke the springs. So in 1861, they abandoned that and went to basically the same gun, but without the priming system. When the Confederates captured Harper's Ferry at the beginning of the war, they didn't capture any guns, but they captured a lot of parts. This is a Richmond-made rifle musket in 1861. They used the same dies for the Maynard priming system, but didn't bother with it. This is called the high hump Richmond, because they use the dies to make their own black plates. And also use some other, in these early ones, there were some other U.S. parts used. I mentioned the 1861 rifle musket. Quite often called the Springfield, which is basically a misnomer because the Army never called them Springfield. Called them Model 1861 rifle musket. This is one, though, that was made by Springfield in 1861. Interesting, well, I shouldn't say interesting story because it's a mystery. When found, it was like this. And it was found 2015, in the remains of an adobe building at Bernal Springs, New Mexico, that was being demolished. Presumably it was behind a wall or something, I don't know. The bayonet was frozen in place. Of course, it's quite rusted. And it was also still loaded at the time. Now, perfectly safe because the touch hole or the nipple was clogged up. I mean, you couldn't have fired it if you wanted it to, but it wasn't quite often you'll find them with birdshot in it. This was with a solid projectile with a mini bulb still in it. At first, we all thought that somehow it got abandoned by members of the 1st Colorado or other troops that went to Glorietta. But, because it was known that they stopped at Bernal Springs. But, I often wondered about the little Z that's stamped here. A book came out last year that explains that. That is a Confederate inspection mark when the Confederates, especially in the Eastern Theater, around 64, when they would recover weapons from a battlefield, they would clean them and repair them and then inspect them for reissue. This is one of them. How it got to Bernal Springs, New Mexico, we have no idea. Apparently some member of the Confederate Army chose to leave, maybe without a pass, and came west and took his gun and bayonet with him. Everything I've been showing you here are muzzle loaders. Even the pistols, they load from the front of the cylinder. All of these load from the muzzle, put powder, bullet down, ram it down, and then a percussion cap, or in the case of the Maynard cap, on the nipple here. There were 2 brands of repeating rifles that came out during the Civil War, the Spencer and the Henry. In my opinion, the Spencer was by far the most effective military weapon. It used a .52 caliber rimfire cartridge, which is basically a great big .22. That was the early development of the self-contained cartridge with a primary. This one, you loaded about 7 of them down here. And then it was bang, bang. It was almost unfair. They didn't come out, didn't reach the troops until 63. There were around, depending who you read, between 600 and 1,200 at the Battle of Gettysburg, but none, or the very most, about 40, were with Buford's cavalry on the first day. And most people don't think they had any. But Custer did have between 600 or 1,200 of these. The rifles, not the carbines. Carbines didn't reach the troops until October of that year. And Custer is quite often given a lot of undue credit, I believe, for his charge at the East Cavalry battlefield, where he charged down the road If he had even 600 of these, and he just put his troops on either side of the road, there wouldn't have been any Confederate charge. This is a Sharps carbine, model 1863. It's unusual for two reasons. One, I just got it a week ago, right after I swore I wasn't going to buy another gun. What's interesting about it is the carving on the stock. Sort of a vine design with the letters JHA in the middle and a ribbon underneath that says Company A Forest Regiment. A search of all the records shows that there were only 2 units that called themselves Forest, both after Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest. One was the 3rd Tennessee, the other was Company A of the 7th Mississippi. A search of JHAs did not come up too much. There was a JHA in the 7th Mississippi, but at least for the records, which are incomplete, he was in Company G. But there were several JAs in both units, and it was not uncommon, especially with Confederate records, to drop the middle initial. So in my mind, this is definitely a Confederate used U.S. carbine, but I couldn't tell you for sure which of the 2 units it was ended up with. It was obviously captured. Just a few other minor things. Did I mention I collect more than guns and swords? This is one of the more interesting things that I own. It is Calpers' Book of Poems, printed in 1846, and the inscription reads, presented to me by my beloved husband with the date, 1849, and signed Philippia Field. On the next flyleaf, in an entirely different handwriting, and also in ink, it says, this book was found by me on the dead body of a Confederate soldier during the Battle of Gettysburg, signed F.G. Patterson, forgetting now what unit, 5th Maine Volunteers. So that's one of the more poignant things, I think. I know I've been going over long. One thing that I've always sort of liked is this picture of a Confederate cavalryman, Franklin Powell, or Pooh, P-O-U. He was in Mormon's battalion of the Confederate cavalry, and he had this picture taken, apparently to send home to show the girls. And when I looked up his records, it said it was 18. This guy looks like about 22. And then I realized he had the mustache painted on. He was apparently trying to grow a mustache, and it didn't show in the picture, so he had it painted on. Last thing, I think, is a piece of hardtack that the note says, issued to him, and I forget the name, by the quartermaster sergeant in 1866 when they were discharged. You see a lot of phony hardtack around. This is real. I have now ran out of things to say. I expect a great big sigh there. With one other thing. On Thursday, our curator here, Elizabeth, a fellow from the History Colorado, came out to see my stuff, and I mentioned that well, she knew I was giving a talk, and I mentioned that I decided not to bother putting on my uniform because I'm too old and too much trouble. And she said, well, you could come as an old veteran. Well, I didn't understand the old part. And I thought about it, and I said, well, you know, I'm a pretty good actor. By cracky, I can do that. Anyway, this is a Civil War reproduction, officer's vest, and a reproduction of the Civil War hat. But this is an original medal, membership medal of a member of the Grand Army of the Republic. And this watch fob has the insignia of the Grand Army of the Republic on it, which of course the Grand Army of the Republic was the American Legion of the Civil War period. And when you open it up, I can do this without my glasses. Anyway, it has a picture inside of the veteran and his wife. Again, I really have run out of things to say. You're welcome, A, if you have any questions. B, you're welcome to come up afterwards. I'll leave this stuff up for a while. Ask any questions that you might have. And as I said earlier, I have no problem with you handling the items, but please ask permission first.
Well, thank you, Bob, so
You
much.
bet.
And again, and please visit our new exhibit upstairs, where Tracy will be there also. So thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you.
Again, if you have any questions,